All right, so today we are talking about the Dust Bowl. And when we are done, Mia, you are going to you're going to do a flip grid for a grade about the Dirty 30s. The Dust Bowl? What was the Dust Bowl? That means what caused it. Why did it happen? And how did the government work to stop this from happening or to prevent this from happening again? And this was around the time of the Great Depression. Remember, the Great Depression was from 1929 to 1939. So on top of everything else that was happening in the United States, there were some states that they were hit by a drought and over farming of their land and just, high winds. And they had a big problem because when all those things add together, you have a dust bowl. And right here it says the Dust Bowl was the name given to a time in the 1930s when there was a combination of a drought, that means no rain, very, very high winds, and poor farming methods. This led to widespread devastation. Crops were lost due to the topsoil being blown away. So what happened was when there's no rain, it's a drought. The farmers, remember in the industrial times, they started using plows and tractors to plow their land and to make their land better for crops. And with this thing, with the new tractors, they could plant more crops. Well, what they did was they plowed up so much of the land that the dirt never had a chance to get its moisture back, because if you dig down in the ground, it's kind of wet. Well, they kept digging it up, and the ground never, with no rain, the dirt just kept drying out. And then, like I told Chesney a while ago, like it's when you put flour on your cabinet and when you're baking, if you blow it, it goes everywhere. So the wind would blow the dirt everywhere. And you can see right here, this farmer, he's like pulling his hat down over his eyes because the wind is blowing the dirt all in his face. And you can see how dry it is. So the soil never had a chance to get its moisture back because they just kept tilling it. And so when there's no water, you can't grow crops. So they weren't able to actually plant their crops either. Okay. The drought and erosion of the Dust Bowl affected 100 million acres centered in the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma. It also affected New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. So right here in this pink section were the hardest hit areas by the drought, the high wind, the soil erosion. And then we have the orange area where it was also very severe, okay? And all the states in the yellow, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota, these areas were also all hit, okay? So they were just really, really dry. The blowing dirt storms reached as far east as New York and Washington. And this is a picture of Elkhart, Kansas. And I think, Mia, your family's from Kansas, aren't they?
Yes, ma'am.
So this man is like walking, it looks like maybe down Main Street in Elkhart. And you can just see the dirt behind him. Like the wind is coming behind him. It looks like a cloud. It's kind of scary looking. And as it traveled, it just dropped dirt. Like the dirt would just fall out of the sky. And so it was very, very disgusting and gross and nasty. Black Sunday on April 14th, 1935, black blizzard from Canada to Texas. So there was a black blizzard, which means the sky just went completely dark. The dust storms could limit visibility to just a few feet. People could not see to drive. The dirt would fill their noses, eyes, and lungs. So what happened was the dirt was so thick, it like actually blocked out the sun. And it blew. And it went all the way from Canada up at the top of North America all the way to Texas. Okay? And if you want to go, we can go back to the map and I'll show you. So right here is Canada. It blew all the way down to Texas. That's how far that wind blew. and how hard it was blowing, and it blocked like all the sunlight from all the way down. And here's a picture of a dust storm. So it looks horrific. Okay. Beginning on May 9th, 1934, a strong 2-day dust storm removed topsoil in one of the worst storms of the Dust Bowl. The dust clouds blew all the way from Chicago, where they deposited 12 million pounds of dust. So in just a second, I'll go back to the map and I'll show you. 2 days later, the same storm reached cities in the east. That winter in 1934 and 35, red snow fell on the New England states due to all the dust still in the atmosphere. So there was so much dirt still in the atmosphere that when it snowed, the snow was actually dirty. Okay? And if y'all don't know where Chicago is, let's go back to our map here. Chicago is over here in Illinois. So think about that. The dirt blew 12 million pounds of dirt from here all the way to Illinois. And it finally stopped blowing, and it dropped the dirt there. And I don't know if you know what 12 million pounds is, but that's a lot. And when the dirt falls, you have to do something with it. Okay? And here's a dirt storm approaching Spearman, Texas on April 14th. After the storms died down, the people had to literally dig themselves out. Here is a man digging his fence line. So fences are kind of high because you have to keep the animals in. There was so much dirt that his fence was under the ground, and he had to dig it out. Now the problem is, what do you do with all that dirt when you dig it out? It's not like snow. It doesn't melt. And so and I'll show you another picture and tell you again what this. Here's like all their tractors and their cars and their houses. Like everything is underground. So they obviously couldn't use their tractors and everything to help them move the dirt. They couldn't get to their shovels because they were under the ground. So they had a big problem. They had to find a way to get all this dirt away. And they had to do it by hand because everything was buried. I mean, can you imagine going outside after a storm and your car being completely under the ground? That's kind of yikes. Here's more pictures of everything buried. Wheat. Okay, so the wheat stalks were broken off with the wind and blowing dirt. So the crops were so dry that if you just barely touched them, they would break. And so the wheat was all dead. The roots were blown out of the ground because remember they dug it up and it was so dry, and the wind would just carry the wheat off. The cows tried to eat the dirty grass, but they just filled their stomachs with mud. So the cows were dying because every time they ate, they weren't actually getting grass. They were just getting a bunch of mud in their stomach. Okay? By 1934, the Yearbook of Agriculture announced that 100 million acres have lost all or most of their topsoil. The topsoil is the very top layer. Another 125 million acres are about to, and 35 million acres cannot grow crops of any kind. So in this time when there was a depression and people were depending on their crops, they actually lost all their crops because of this. And so they couldn't afford to stay and live. What little crops did survive, the jackrabbits and grasshoppers would attack and eat, because grasshoppers and rabbits, they eat the grass and the crops. So farmers used to have what were called rabbit drives. They would herd all the rabbits into a fenced-in area and kill them with bats and skillets. So they would stand up there with bats and with skillets and kill the rabbits. And I'm sure they would eat the rabbits once they killed them, because people eat rabbit meat. Oh, not me. Many new farmers headed west with the Homestead Act. Then, with the invention of the tractor, combine, etc., farming was on the rise. So that's why this happened, because there was so much farming of the land, and there was no rain, and there was high winds that they just pretty much killed the soil. The topsoil was turned under for planting. There were no trees for windbreaks. Also, crop rotation was not used. So there was nothing to protect this wind or this land from the wind. And I know that my dad, he is a farmer, and what he would do is they would plant trees around their land to kind of stop the wind, because they live out in West Texas where it does get very windy and there's not a lot of trees. He would also have, I don't know if y'all have ever seen them, but when they were doing construction across the street from the school, there was like those orange fences, like in front of the place. They used those because they're also wind breaks, so they would keep the wind from hitting the soil so much if it was dry. Also, crop rotation. Crops use minerals from the soil. So what they would do is they would rotate their crops. Like for 2 years, they would plant peanuts. And then 2 years later, for the next 2 years, they'd plant corn. Or not corn, but cotton. And then they would plant soy beans. And then, so they would rotate the crops so that the different plants weren't using all the nutrients from the soil. So that's what caused it. The over farming of the land, no wind, and strong rain, or strong winds. Here is a farmer and his sons. In 1936, they're actually going to dig their barn out. Okay? That barns are tall. They're walking on top of their barn pretty much. The black blizzard struck so suddenly that many farmers became lost in their own fields and suffocated. Some were only yards away from shelter that they could not see. So it was so windy, it was so dark that they were like very, very close to their house, but they could not see their house and they could not get to it because of the strong winds. Like this guy right here is getting blown over, that they would suffocate because the dirt would get inside their throats and their lungs and they couldn't breathe. The dirt clogged car engines, so it would suck the engines in, or the dirt into their engines and kill the cars. Dirt blew into homes through little cracks by the windows, so they would put wet blankets over their windows to kind of stick to the dirt, but that only worked a little bit because it was also hot, and so the towels would dry very, very quickly. And my grandparents were kids when this happened. They said it was awful. Hospitals began to fill with people with dust pneumonia or the brown plague. The dirt filled their lungs. So here we are. This is what their masks looked like then. And they would wear them because it would filter out the dirt. And people were coming in and their lungs were just so full of the dirt and everything that they were getting very sick because they couldn't breathe. You can tell by this woman's face how rough it was. People depended on their crops for money. With no crops, there was no money. And food was very scarce, and so was the money. Because remember, this was during the Depression, so they just were hit very hard. This was a horrible, horrible time in our history. Dust storms crackled with powerful static electricity. So, like when you go to the grocery store, sometimes when you touch the freezer handles, you know how it shocks you? Or when you're walking through the building and or a house and you touch the doorknob and it shocks you? That's static electricity. And there was so much static electricity that built up between the ground and the dust in the air that blue flames jumped from barbed wire fences. So you could like see a burst of a flame come out of the fence. Okay? Or people would, shock each other when they were shaking hands. And it could create a spark that was so powerful it could knock you down. That's how powerful the electric charge was. Since static electricity could short out engines in car radios, motorists driving through the dirt storms dragged chains from the back of their cars to ground it so that they wouldn't catch on fire, because there's gas in cars, electricity and sparks and flames. That's a recipe for disaster. So they would tie chains or put chains on the backs of their cars to ground it so they wouldn't get the flames or the electricity. Hundreds of thousands of people and families were forced to leave their farms. These people were often called Okies, since so many came from Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was the hardest hit area. Many migrated to California and other states. About 25% of the population left the affected states by 1940. 2.5 million people had moved out of the Plains states. The Dust Bowl refugees from Oklahoma arrived in California in June 1935. And so these people right here were called Okies, and as you can see, they had all of their belongings on their cars because they didn't have the trucks and everything to, or the nice little moving trucks like we have. So they put it all in their car and they moved to California where there was more rain and they needed a better life for themselves. So finally, yes, ma'am.
When they moved to California, aren't they risking like terrible hurricanes and earthquakes?
Yes, there were hurricanes and earthquakes and everything, but they had to go someplace where they could live and they could grow crops and they could get money. And so their lives were pretty much ruined where they were at, and it was going to take a very, very long time to rebuild after all of this. So yes, they were risking that, but they had to weigh the effects. And actually, when you go to California, yes, hurricanes, you get strong winds and everything, but if you don't live kind of close to the coast, then you don't really get hit as hard. Okay, so finally, President Roosevelt, remember, he got elected into office, and he created the New Deal Act. And the New Deal helped people get things back on track. Also, it finally rained, and the grass began to grow back and hold the soil. So, because the grass, it acts as a wind barrier, and the roots can hold the soil to the ground. They planted trees to serve as windbreaks. Native grasses were left alone. Native grasses are the grasses that can grow really well in that area, so they belong there. Farmers started to rotate their crops, so they didn't plant cotton every single year. They planted cotton and then soybeans, or cotton and then wheat. So they rotated their crops. They also adopted the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, and it was signed into law by Roosevelt on April 27, 1935. This law gave farmers money to plant native grasses, trees, and certain vegetables to protect the soil from erosion and kept it from blowing away. So you need something to hold that soil into place. So he gave the farmers who had lost everything money to plant the grass, to plant the trees. Okay? Vegetables. They would hold the soil down, like root vegetables like potatoes and corn, or not corn, I'm sorry, potatoes and carrots and stuff to hold it into place. And here's another picture of the dirt storm coming to get the people. Okay? And then this is a book, remind me next year and I'll show it to you. It's called Out of the Dust, and it is actually a book about this little girl or the children who lived during the Dust Bowl. Okay? So whenever we get done with this today, you do need to go to your Flipgrid. It's the next one on the module, and tell about the Dust Bowl. What was it? What caused it? And how did they fix it? Okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop this.